The very first thing I noticed was the heavy lock. It was absolutely not mine. It was shiny, brand new, and clipped entirely right through the rusted latch on my late mother's old barn door, exactly like whoever maliciously put it there. Firmly believed they had every single right to keep me permanently out. I stood silently in the gravel driveway, tightly holding a heavy toolbox in one hand and the single key my mother had safely left me in the other, staring directly at that illegal lock while the cold October wind violently pushed dry leaves across the yard. That massive barn had proudly belonged to my family for exactly 40 long years. My father meticulously stored heavy hay in it. My sweet mother safely kept precious Christmas decorations high up in the loft. I personally learned exactly how to swing a heavy hammer right in that very barn long before I was ever old enough to legally drive. And now, some arrogant stranger had maliciously locked me completely out of it. So I ruthlessly cut the lock right off. The heavy wooden doors groaned violently open, and for a terrifying second, I honestly thought I had walked completely into the wrong building. The entire barn was illegally packed wall to wall with massive amounts of expensive furniture. Heavy sofas were wrapped tightly in thick plastic. Expensive dining chairs were recklessly stacked in towering columns. There were massive wooden tables, rolled rugs, tall lamps, and countless heavy boxes explicitly labeled holiday event, clubhouse remodel, and board storage. There were heavily framed pictures, tall fake plants, countless folding chairs, expensive old sound equipment, and an entire massive sectional couch completely shoved aggressively against my late father's dusty workbench. I just stood there in absolute stunned silence. Then, an expensive white SUV aggressively pulled right into my private driveway, and Linda Carver stepped out exactly like she had been maliciously waiting for this exact moment. Linda was the arrogant president of Maple Ridge Estates, HOA, the wealthy gated neighborhood built directly beside my mother's property. She wore a pale blue blazer, dark sunglasses, and the exact kind of vicious expression arrogant people constantly use when they falsely think their pure confidence is an actual legal document. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" she snapped furiously. I simply looked right back at the packed barn and replied coldly, "I am opening my own barn." "That expensive furniture officially belongs to the association," she demanded. I fired back. "Then exactly why is it illegally sitting inside my private building?" She stubbornly crossed her arms and stated, "Your mother graciously allowed us to safely use this space." I simply answered, "No, she absolutely did not." Linda smiled, a highly condescending smile, and whispered, "Tyler, your mother never formally complained." That single sentence hit vastly harder than I ever expected. My sick mother had spent the entire last year of her fragile life desperately in and out of brutal hospitals. She barely had the physical strength to even walk to the mailbox, let alone brutally fight an arrogant HOA president over an old barn she could simply no longer physically use. I looked right at her and demanded coldly, "Show me the official lease." Linda blinked in pure confusion. I relentlessly continued, "Show me the binding storage agreement, the recorded written permission, or absolutely anything officially signed by my mother." Her smug smile instantly faded as she deflected. "This has always been a highly informal community arrangement," I bluntly stated. "No, this is massive, illegal trespassing." She pointed a furious, shaking finger directly at my chest and threatened, "If one single association item is missing, damaged, sold, moved, or even touched, the HOA will aggressively hold you personally responsible." I immediately pulled out my smartphone, hit record, and stated firmly, "For the official legal record, I am Tyler Brooks. I am currently standing entirely on my private family property. This exact barn is officially listed directly on my legal deed and tax record, and Maple Ridge Estates HOA has illegally filled it entirely with heavy furniture without ever showing any lease, any easement, any storage agreement, or any written permission whatsoever." Linda's smug face completely changed as she demanded, "Stop recording immediately." I simply replied, "Absolutely not." Then I looked straight up at the high corner beam and clearly saw the old security camera my brother had strictly installed for Mom, exactly after someone violently stole heavy copper wire straight from the grader shed. A small red light was beautifully blinking, completely proving the camera was absolutely still recording. Later that exact night, I carefully pulled the massive video footage. And that was exactly when I clearly saw Maple Ridge vendors illegally moving heavy furniture straight into my private barn, exactly 3 short weeks right after my sick mother entered hospice care. Linda had absolutely not inherited legal permission. She had maliciously taken massive advantage of a dying woman's silence. My name is Tyler Brooks, and I absolutely never thought I would ever come back to that old barn as the sole owner. I proudly grew up in rural Kentucky, on a small piece of private property sitting right outside Maple Ridge. It was absolutely not a massive ranch, not a huge commercial farm, and certainly not some wealthy luxury estate. Just 8 quiet acres, an old house, a gravel driveway, one solid barn, and enough deep memories to make absolutely every single property repair feel incredibly personal. My hardworking father completely built half that barn entirely himself, meticulously replacing the aging siding, heavily reinforcing the upper loft, and pouring the small concrete pad right near the back door. He strictly kept his heavy tools there, massive bales of hay, and countless broken pieces of equipment he proudly swore he would eventually fix someday. When I was just a kid, that massive barn felt incredibly huge. But right after my father sadly died, it simply felt devastatingly empty. My stubborn mother safely stayed in that old house as long as she physically could, proudly paying her county taxes, keeping the tall grass perfectly mowed, and meticulously keeping a handwritten folder for absolutely every single bill, minor repair, and legal property document. Then, she got incredibly sick. While she was actively fighting an intense medical treatment, Maple Ridge Estates maliciously became vastly more aggressive. The arrogant board started acting exactly like absolutely anything, sitting anywhere near their luxury community, was officially part of their pristine image. They aggressively complained about our old wooden fence. Then they aggressively complained about the aged barn roof. Then they furiously complained about my mother's driveway gravel washing slightly near their massive entrance after heavy seasonal storms. Linda Carver was undeniably the absolute worst of them all. She constantly loved fabricated phrases, exactly like community standards, and shared appearance. She once audaciously told my dying mother that the old barn looked completely abandoned and actively reduced the fragile visual value of Maple Ridge. My brave mother simply told her, "Then absolutely do not look at it." I deeply wish I had been right there for that glorious moment. Right after Mom sadly passed away, I quietly returned to legally settle the family property. I was a hard-working roofer strictly by trade, desperately running small jobs and furiously trying to keep my loyal crew fully paid. I simply planned to heavily fix up the old barn, maybe securely store my heavy equipment there, and maybe sell the old house much later if I absolutely had to. But when I finally opened those heavy barn doors, I instantly found out Maple Ridge had arrogantly already decided exactly what my property was permanently for: storage. Their massive, illegal, unpaid storage. If you have absolutely ever had a private garage, an old barn, a quiet shed, a long driveway, or entirely empty land that some arrogant neighbor aggressively started using simply because they falsely thought you were gone, entirely too old, incredibly too tired, or far too quiet to ever stop them, leave your thoughts in the comments. Private property absolutely does not ever become public land just because the legal owner gets terribly sick. Pure silence is absolutely not legal consent. And the arrogant phrase "we have simply used it for a while" is absolutely not a binding legal lease. The very night right after I discovered the massive pile of illegal furniture, I meticulously opened my mother's old rusted filing cabinet. Sitting right inside was a heavily stuffed folder clearly labeled Maple Ridge. Most of the file was purely fabricated complaint letters from Linda, but right near the very back, I flawlessly found one single certified legal letter my mother had legally sent exactly 6 agonizing months right before she passed away. It explicitly stated that Maple Ridge Estates absolutely had zero legal permission to ever enter her private barn, store any association property, or use any single portion of her private land whatsoever. Right at the very bottom, my brave mother had written in shaking blue pen, "They arrogantly think I am just too weak to ever fight them." That was the exact moment I completely stopped seeing the massive piles of furniture as simple clutter. I instantly started seeing it exactly for what it truly was: bulletproof legal proof. Linda's first highly aggressive email arrived the very next morning with the arrogant subject line, "Unauthorized. Interference with association property. I almost laughed out loud when I read how she maliciously claimed that I had illegally entered an established HOA storage area and deliberately damaged an official association lock. She outrageously demanded that I immediately replace the lock, completely stop accessing my own private barn, and generously give Maple Ridge exactly 60 days to properly coordinate the careful removal of their highly sensitive property. It was literally old, moldy clubhouse furniture, cheap holiday decorations, and rusted folding chairs. I ruthlessly replied with exactly one single question. Please immediately provide the legal lease, the binding storage agreement, the recorded easement, or any strict written permission legally allowing Maple Ridge Estates, HOA, to ever use my private barn. She absolutely did not provide a single one. Instead, the massive property management company aggressively emailed me a threatening notice. It falsely stated the barn had been widely used for community storage for several long years, and that my illegal interference could instantly expose me to massive financial liability if absolutely anything ever went missing. So, I methodically walked straight back through the entire barn and meticulously documented absolutely everything. Heavy sofas with official Maple Ridge inventory tags, massive boxes clearly marked Spring Social, a huge wooden conference table with a heavily cracked leg, massive clubhouse rugs thickly rolled in plastic, 2 expensive lamps with the original price stickers incredibly still attached, and a massive stack of official HOA invoices literally taped directly to one box. Right on the crystal clear security camera footage, I explicitly saw professional vendors illegally entering the private barn at least 9 separate times. One damning clip clearly showed Linda arrogantly holding the heavy door wide open while 2 men aggressively carried in massive chairs. Another clip explicitly showed a hired maintenance worker illegally changing the heavy lock, and yet another flawlessly showed Linda pointing directly toward the back wall and commanding aggressively, "Put the heavy new stuff exactly where her old tools used to be." Her tools. My late mother's heavy tools. I instantly sent Linda a highly certified legal notice explicitly giving the arrogant HOA exactly 10 days to completely remove absolutely everything, fully repair any and all property damage, and fully pay for the expensive lock they had illegally replaced. Linda furiously called me exactly 2 hours later, snapping aggressively, "You are being incredibly unreasonable. You illegally filled my private barn entirely with HOA furniture." I fired back. "It was completely unused space," she deflected. "It was absolutely not yours," I countered. "Your mother never officially objected," she lied. "She literally sent you a certified legal letter," I stated coldly. There was complete, dead silence on the line. Then she viciously whispered, "Your mother was incredibly confused right near the very end." That was the exact moment I violently hung up the phone, because if I had stayed on that line for even one more second, I would have said something my attorney later would have strictly told me absolutely not to say. 3 days later, Linda arrogantly sent a hired vendor directly to the barn again, absolutely not to remove their illegal furniture, but to audaciously add even more. The security camera flawlessly caught him carrying 2 heavy boxes explicitly labeled "Clubhouse Lighting." I immediately walked straight out before he could ever leave, and he completely froze when he actually saw me. I aggressively asked, "Who exactly told you to bring that illegal garbage here?" He looked incredibly embarrassed and stammered, "Mrs. Carver explicitly said this was official HOA storage." I pointed a furious finger straight toward the gravel driveway and commanded, "Take it completely back." And he absolutely did. Then, I officially called a ruthless lawyer. My fierce attorney's name was Rebecca Miles. She specialized heavily in complex property disputes, massive abandoned property issues, and the exact kind of toxic neighbor drama that arrogantly starts incredibly small and violently turns incredibly expensive. When I meticulously told her the entire enraging story, she absolutely did not tell me to just throw all their expensive garbage completely outside into the rain. She strictly told me absolutely not to touch a single thing. Carefully photograph absolutely everything, rigorously inventory it, heavily secure it, and let's strictly follow the ironclad legal process, she commanded. So that is exactly what I flawlessly did. I took massive wide-angle photos of absolutely every single corner, highly detailed close-ups of every single inventory tag, crystal-clear videos of the massive boxes, and undeniable screenshots straight from the security camera, flawless copies of Linda's incredibly arrogant emails, a certified copy of my legal property deed, official county tax records explicitly showing the barn was entirely on my private property, the physical invoice for the heavy lock I forcefully had to cut, and the highly certified letter my late mother had bravely sent explicitly telling the HOA to absolutely never enter or store anything inside her private barn. Rebecca instantly sent a brutal formal demand letter directly to Maple Ridge Estates, the massive property management company, Linda Carver personally, and the exact vendors clearly identified right on the security camera. The ironclad letter explicitly stated the HOA's massive property was currently being illegally stored completely without permission on strictly private land. It ruthlessly demanded total removal by a specific, unarguable deadline, full payment for back storage fees, total repair of any property damage, full reimbursement for the destroyed lock, and written legal confirmation that the arrogant HOA had absolutely no legal right to ever enter the private barn ever again. It also strictly warned that if the massive property was absolutely not entirely removed, we would ruthlessly seek immediate court and sheriff guidance for legally handling abandoned or unlawfully stored property. Linda's arrogant response was pure, blinding hubris. She maliciously wrote that Maple Ridge would absolutely not be rushed, that the massive items were highly valuable association assets, and that I would be held massively liable for any single loss. Rebecca carefully read it and smiled viciously, stating, "Good." She just fully admitted in writing that they legally own the exact items and aggressively still refuse to completely remove them. Then, she meticulously looked straight through the HOA's massive governing documents. She clearly proved there was absolutely no authority whatsoever to rent external storage outside the HOA without formal board approval. Absolutely no valid lease. No commercial insurance coverage for property illegally stored in my private barn. No record of any payment ever given to my sick mother. No formal permission. Absolutely nothing. Then, one deeply frustrated Maple Ridge resident quietly sent me a highly confidential copy of official meeting minutes straight from the previous year. It explicitly showed where Linda had arrogantly told the entire board the private barn was completely available in formal storage simply because my sick mother was completely no longer actively using it. That single, cruel phrase made my hands shake with pure rage. Not because it was clever, but because it was incredibly cruel. My mother was dying, and Linda maliciously turned that tragedy into arrogant availability. Rebecca immediately filed the necessary legal paperwork and requested highly armed assistance directly from the county sheriff's office. The absolute second the strict notice period expired, she stated coldly, "We are absolutely not illegally stealing their precious property. We are legally forcing them to fully answer for maliciously abandoning it completely inside yours." The absolute legal deadline finally came and went, and Maple Ridge removed absolutely nothing. Linda did arrogantly drive by exactly twice. The security camera flawlessly caught her aggressively stopping right near the barn, taking invasive photos, and then quickly leaving. She absolutely did not send movers. She absolutely did not send a check. And she certainly did not send a valid lease. Just another highly threatening email demanding, "Do absolutely not dispose of valuable association property." Rebecca instantly replied directly with the massive court filing and certified copies of absolutely every single legal notice. The armed sheriff's office officially came out exactly the following week. Deputy Alan Price methodically walked straight through the massive barn alongside me and Rebecca. He carefully looked at the heavy furniture, the clear labels, the undeniable camera footage, and the highly certified letter from my late mother. Then he looked directly at me and asked the one incredibly simple question absolutely everyone at the HOA kept cowardly avoiding. "Do they have any legal permission whatsoever to be here?" Rebecca firmly answered, "Absolutely not." Linda arrived frantically exactly 15 minutes later, incredibly furious, and walked aggressively straight into the barn exactly like she arrogantly still owned the entire room. "This is highly valuable HOA property," she demanded loudly. Deputy Price simply nodded and asked coldly, "Then exactly why on earth is it sitting completely inside his private barn?" Linda aggressively deflected. There was an informal understanding. He pressed. "Written?" "It was strictly informal," she stammered. "With the current legal owner?" he asked. "With his sick mother," she lied. Rebecca immediately handed him my mother's certified legal letter. He read it incredibly slowly, before looking completely through Linda and stating, "This exact legal document says she explicitly told you to absolutely never enter or store any property right here." Linda's smug face completely tightened in pure panic as she cruelly whispered, "She was absolutely not well." Deputy Price's stern voice cooled entirely to absolute ice as he stated firmly, "Ma'am, that statement is absolutely not helping you in the slightest. The official legal order explicitly allowed the massive property to be formally inventoried and forcefully removed, entirely for public auction, if the arrogant HOA massively failed to properly claim it strictly, through the required legal process and fully pay all the heavy assessed costs." Linda suddenly desperately wanted vastly more time. Rebecca fired back. "You had massive legal notice," Linda frantically snapped. "You absolutely cannot illegally auction off pristine community property." Deputy Price simply stated, "Then you absolutely should have properly removed it when you were legally ordered to." That was the exact beautiful moment her pure, blinding confidence completely broke into a million pieces. This was absolutely no longer Linda arrogantly threatening a grieving son with fabricated HOA letters. This was a fully uniformed, armed county sheriff standing directly inside my private barn, rigorously reading binding legal documents entirely out loud. And absolutely every single legal document unequivocally said the exact same devastating thing. The massive barn was entirely mine. The HOA storage was completely unauthorized. The certified notice was absolutely ironclad, and Maple Ridge had arrogantly ignored every single final chance to ever properly fix it. The massive legal inventory aggressively took exactly most of the entire morning. Absolutely every single massive item was meticulously photographed, formally tagged, and legally listed. Heavy sofas, countless clubhouse chairs, massive boxes of holiday decorations, thick rolled rugs, cheap folding tables, expensive lamps, a severely cracked wooden conference table, massive boxes of cheap fake garland, extremely old sound equipment, and an entire heavy cabinet completely full of useless dishes. Some delicate things had heavy, dangerous mildew entirely growing right on them. Some had massive, devastating mouse damage. Some had brutal, deep scratches strictly from being completely stacked so incredibly badly. And one highly expensive rug had been carelessly rolled straight against a deeply damp wall for so incredibly long it aggressively smelled exactly like rotting garbage. Linda stood furiously outside the private barn alongside two incredibly nervous board members, frantically calling absolutely everyone on her phone. At one completely unhinged point, she screamed loudly, "Those massive items were officially purchased entirely with HOA funds." A deeply disgusted resident who had quietly come over just to watch loudly fired back, "Then exactly why on earth were they illegally rotting completely inside someone else's private barn?" Linda absolutely did not dare to answer. Rebecca ruthlessly presented the massive, ironclad cost sheet. Heavy storage fees entirely for the long time after the strict notice, expensive lock replacement, massive professional barn cleanup, heavy inventory expenses, towering legal and administrative costs, and massive structural moisture damage entirely to the back shelving and a large part of the wooden floor. The public auction was absolutely not some wild, chaotic revenge scene. It was incredibly boring, highly official, and absolutely brutal, exactly in the precise way that massive legal paperwork can be incredibly brutal. The massive items were meticulously removed, legally sold strictly through the proper municipal process, and absolutely all the meager proceeds were immediately applied directly to the massive costs. Some of the expensive furniture predictably sold for vastly less than Linda arrogantly ever expected. A lot vastly less. Because incredibly old clubhouse sofas are absolutely not worth very much when they aggressively smell exactly like dead mice and heavily rotting damp wood. Furious residents instantly started aggressively asking massive questions absolutely almost immediately. Exactly who on earth legally approved using the private Brooks barn? Exactly why was there absolutely no valid legal lease? Exactly why was expensive HOA property completely uninsured while sitting entirely inside a private building? Exactly why did arrogant Linda maliciously ignore a strictly certified legal notice? Exactly why were hired vendors illegally entering private land completely outside the HOA? And the one devastating question that absolutely hurt her, the absolute most. Exactly why did the arrogant board stubbornly keep massive amounts of furniture inside a private barn long after the owner's sick mother legally told them to permanently stop? Linda desperately tried to push the massive blame entirely onto the management company. The furious management company instantly blamed Linda's strict personal instructions. The hired vendors immediately produced highly damning emails directly from Linda, explicitly calling the private barn available community storage. By the absolute end of the chaotic week, Maple Ridge residents were absolutely not angry at me anymore in the slightest. They were completely furious that their massive, expensive dues had explicitly bought furniture. Their very own arrogant president had maliciously hidden entirely inside someone else's private barn. After the brutal legal auction completely concluded, Maple Ridge permanently lost absolutely most of the massive furniture Linda had tried so incredibly hard to arrogantly protect. While the total money absolutely did not make me incredibly rich, it entirely covered absolutely all the massive costs, and that was absolutely more than enough. The completely disgraced HOA was legally forced to fully reimburse the massive remaining cleanup expense, heavily pay a very large part of my expensive attorney fees, and officially sign an ironclad, binding written agreement legally, confirming they had absolutely zero legal right whatsoever to ever enter my private property or ever use my private barn for any storage ever again. They also had to humiliatingly send a highly detailed official notice entirely to all the residents explicitly explaining exactly why their precious association property had been forcefully removed and publicly sold. That single devastating notice did vastly more massive damage to Linda's massive ego than absolutely anything I could have ever personally said. At the very next heavily packed HOA meeting, furious residents aggressively demanded massive answers. Exactly why was there no valid lease? Exactly who authorized completely illegal storage entirely outside the pristine community? Exactly why did the arrogant board maliciously ignore the absolute legal owner's strictly certified notice? And exactly why on earth did Linda constantly claim my sick mother completely allowed it when there was a highly certified legal letter perfectly proving the exact complete opposite? Linda desperately tried to survive the onslaught by claiming she had merely acted entirely in the fragile community's absolute best interest. Until a furious man, standing right in the very back, stood up and screamed, "You maliciously used a dying woman's private barn simply because you arrogantly thought absolutely nobody would ever stop you." The entire crowded room instantly went completely, deadly silent. Linda cowardly resigned right before the official recall vote, leaving behind a highly bitter resignation letter outrageously claiming she had been completely unfairly targeted by an incredibly aggressive outsider who absolutely did not understand their delicate community needs. Outsider. My proud family completely owned that very barn decades before Maple Ridge ever existed, long before their luxury clubhouse, long before their expensive events, and long before arrogant Linda foolishly decided that my sweet mother's devastating illness somehow magically made our private property incredibly convenient for her. I absolutely did not respond publicly in the slightest. I simply and quietly cleaned my own barn. It took exactly 3 long, exhausting weekends. I meticulously swept out piles of broken glass, thick layers of heavy dust, massive amounts of mouse droppings, and incredibly old, rotting packing material. I properly repaired the heavy back shelf, perfectly replaced the heavy metal latch, and proudly put my father's massive heavy tools right back on the wooden wall, exactly where they beautifully belonged. Then I securely mounted a highly visible brand new metal sign straight on the heavy door. Private barn. No HOA storage. It was absolutely not clever. It was certainly not angry. It was just perfectly, legally clear. I absolutely did not win by maliciously throwing their expensive furniture completely outside into the pouring rain. I absolutely did not win by illegally selling it completely secretly, and I absolutely did not win by foolishly losing my fierce temper. I completely won precisely because I securely saved the camera footage, meticulously read the legal deed, flawlessly found my mother's ironclad letter, instantly sent strictly certified notice, rigorously followed the exact legal process, and perfectly let the armed sheriff do absolutely everything strictly in broad daylight. That is exactly what arrogant Linda never truly understood. A private barn absolutely does not magically become public community storage simply because it is incredibly quiet. A sick owner's fragile silence is absolutely not legal consent, An arrogant long habit is absolutely not a binding legal lease. The Synalysis, an expensive HOA property, absolutely does not somehow magically get vastly more legal rights than the private land it is illegally sitting on. If this story made you deeply think about old barns, private garages, heavy storage units, arrogant HOA property, massive abandoned furniture, or highly toxic neighbors who maliciously use your private land simply because they foolishly think you are entirely too tired to ever stop them, share it directly with someone who proudly owns an entirely empty building, or recently inherited family property. And if anyone has ever arrogantly told you, "We have simply used it for years, so we can definitely keep using it," leave your thoughts directly in the comments. Because the absolute second you meticulously read the legal deed, securely save the ironclad proof, and rigorously follow the exact legal process, arrogant community storage can completely become exactly what it absolutely always was: massive, illegal trespass entirely with cheap furniture.